Talk, we're thrilled that you could join us. Our presenter today is Doug Eady, President and CEO of Doug Eady & Company. Doug has a wealth of experience in the nonprofit sector. He served as a Peace Corps volunteer for 3 years in Ethiopia and later held a number of senior executive positions in the public and nonprofit sectors. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Illinois Urbana, Doug received his master's degree in management from the Weatherhead School of Case Western Reserve University. Since founding Doug Eady & Company 25 years ago, Doug has assisted over 500 nonprofit and public organizations. He is a prolific author, having written 21 books, including his best-selling The Board Savvy CEO, and over 100 articles focused on board and CEO leadership and strategic change. Welcome, Doug. We have a group that is eager to get started, so I'll hand the program over to you.
Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Tampa Bay, Florida, where I'm actually looking out at the Gulf of Mexico this morning. Just a couple of preliminaries. Actually, I think I might be muted. Let's see. Jason, can you hear me? Hello?
Yep, I can hear you loud and clear, Doug.
Oh, okay. Did you hear my introduction? I thought I was muted.
Oh, yep, I heard you. You're sounding good.
Okay. Well, anyway, let me say again, greetings, everyone, from Tampa Bay, Florida. The book, The Board Savvy CEO, is the basis for today's presentation, and I want you to know it's available from the Society on its website, so if you're interested, take a look. I also want you to know that my company manages 3 national blogs that provide actually a tremendous amount of free content. The general nonprofit blog is extraordinaryceo.com. We have 2 others, the Board Savvy Transit CEO and the Board Savvy Superintendent, in their respective areas. Not only about 150 articles, but several podcasts. Now, I'd like to begin our look at this wild and wonderful world of nonprofit leadership by asking you to think about 3 questions that every Board Savvy CEO I've worked with over the past 25 or so years has thought about fairly frequently. And you might want, after this webinar, to go back to these questions and actually answer them. First question. What does your board do best as a governing body, and what does it do less well? What are its strengths and weaknesses? Second question. If you look back over the past year or 2, what really striking governing accomplishments of your board stick out? What are the really notable achievements of your board? Not your nonprofit, but your board itself. And these are usually, of course, significant decisions. And then third, what governing issues is your nonprofit facing right now that need your attention as CEO? So, with those in mind, let's begin to talk about the wild and wonderful world of nonprofit governing. And let's see here. I might have skipped too quickly across the slide. What's the lay of the land? In the first place, of course, you all know that if you're going to succeed over the long run as a CEO, you're going to have a really close, productive, and enduring partnership with your board. A rock-solid partnership is the basis for CEO achievement. Now, it's not easy, and I'm sure you all know this, to build and maintain a strong partnership with a board for a couple reasons. One, the cast of characters. by definition, you've got a really high-achieving, often very willful and demanding group of people at the top, CEOs and board members, and it creates a kind of combustible mix of people. And you add to that the fact that the issues, the decisions that come to a board are without exception the highest stakes, the most complex issues. And what happens over time is this relationship wears out very quickly, especially when you have to deal with negative issues like a budget overrun, revenue not flowing in on schedule, and so on. And finally, I want you to keep in mind, there is no field, no well-developed field called nonprofit governance. It's an important function, but it has not developed yet into a field. You won't find concentrations in graduate school, for example, in nonprofit governance. So at this point in time, you are in frontier territory. There's no universally accepted principles or set of principles. There aren't universally accepted best practices, and there's a lot of really bad advice floating around, what I call erroneous assumptions that we're going to talk about in a minute. Now, there are three keys I'm going to focus on the next few minutes with you to building a really solid partnership with your board. Number one, you got to be what I call board savvy. Number two, you're going to have to pay a lot of attention to managing human relationships. Boards are people, of course, and often not easy people to work with. So it takes a lot of management of the relationship with the board for this partnership to stay healthy. And finally, if you want board members to be dependable partners, you need to figure a way of turning them into what I call satisfied owners of their governing work, as opposed to being an audience for finished products. Audiences tend to be critics, not partners. And so one of our challenges as CEOs is to figure out how I turn my board members into partners who feel like they own the governing function and the governing work they do. So let's begin by looking at this critter I call the board savvy CEO. What does he or she look like? Well, number one, the board savvy CEO is characterized by a positive attitude. Not an ounce of defensiveness, no obsession about protecting the staff from the board, the board savvy CEO is not consumed with worry about micromanagement. What the board savvy CEO sees when she looks at a board is an asset, and she accepts the challenge of capitalizing on that asset and developing that asset. And, of course, to do that, the board-savvy CEO has to make governing a top-tier function, one of the two or three preeminent functions of the CEO is governing. The second characteristic of the board-savvy CEOs I've seen is that they've turned themselves into real experts in this non-field we call nonprofit governance. It's not easy to do that. And as I said, the field's filled with erroneous assumptions that I call insidious foes of the board CEO working relationship. But the board savvy CEO does the reading, attends the workshops, looks for mentors and so on to become a real expert in this field. Now, the third characteristic is that the board savvy CEO concentrates on two specific functional areas within the area of nonprofit governance. what I say is they wear two critical hats. One is chief relationship manager, concentrating on the relationship with the board, the relationship with the board chair, the board's relationship with the executive team, and so on. And also what I call chief governing process designer, mapping out structure and process that will turn board members into owners as opposed to an audience. Now, making governing the top priority obviously isn't rocket science. Number one, it's a matter of spending time. And my experience is that between 25 and 30%, minimum 25% of a CEO's time has to be devoted, and I mean prime time, to the governing function if the relationship with the board's going to be healthy. And there's a little trick of the trade I want to share with you, and I was trying to think this morning where I first heard this. I think it was from a nonprofit CEO, Chris Fox, International Association for Dental Research, who shared this with me first. And what Chris said was, I'm responsible for the whole association, the International Association for Dental Research, a large nonprofit, growing nonprofit. I'm responsible for all internal operations. But he said, you know what, Doug? I also think of myself as executive director, if you will, of a very specific program. And I don't say this to my board. It's not something I go around talking about publicly. But I think of the governing function and my board as a very specific program that's uniquely mine. And I devote a lot of time to thinking about the board, monitoring how well it's doing, identifying issues, coming up with strategies for board development, and closely managing my relationship with that board. And I do not expect volunteers on my board to be able to do this. They really need me to play the leading role. Now, before we move on from the Board Savvy CEO, let me take a moment to talk about these, what I call insidious foes of a strong board CEO partnership. The insidious foe is basically an erroneous assumption about some aspect of governing that's insidious because it sounds very plausible. In fact, very often, and this is why governing can be a fairly dangerous field for CEOs who don't pay close attention to it, very often you'll even have consultants who will recommend some of this dubious wisdom to their clients. And let me give you a couple of examples. You really got to be what's called a cautious consumer of information in this rapidly changing area of nonprofit governance. You know, the Latin term, and I think it's a legal term as well, is caveat emptor. Buyer beware, consumer beware. Well, one of the very common ones is the first one here. If things are going really well, my organization's humming along, we're meeting our goals, we've got a balanced budget, revenues are flowing in, I'm doing a good job as CEO, the relationship is sound. I don't have to worry about it. Well, you all probably have learned by now in your careers that's definitely not true. I was thinking back recently about this, and I would say for every one CEO I've seen get into trouble with the board for serious performance reasons, for some kind of underperformance, I've seen 10 get into trouble for relationship problems. Classic case is Mary Ellen Elia, who was CEO and superintendent of the sixth largest school district in the country, the Hillsborough County Schools here in the Tampa Bay area, and was named Superintendent of the Year in Florida, got a $100 million grant from the Gates Foundation to improve teaching, became a national figure while heading the Hillsborough schools, a finalist for Superintendent of the Year nationally, and doing all that great work. She was fired without cause, without warning, and all the school board said was, we can't work with you. You took your eye off the relationship ball. We didn't feel you were working as a close partner with us. No performance problems at all. And I have to tell you, friends, that happens all the time. A second bit of dubious wisdom, what I call an erroneous assumption, is that you've got a firewall that separates the board's work, called governing or policy making, from the work of executive and administrative management. That's as far from the truth as it's possible to be. Almost every important decision in the area of governing, whether it's adopting a budget, a new value statement, an investment in an innovative program, whatever, every one of those decisions involves the CEO sitting at a table with at least a board committee and sometimes more board members with the executive team. Governing is, by definition, a collaborative team sport. And here's one that's caused a lot of damage. There are people trotting around the country saying that smaller boards are better than larger boards, and so they've embarked on board downsizing. Once again, a very dangerous, erroneous assumption. What you gain in efficiency, if you do gain anything, and what you gain in control over the board from downsizing, you lose tremendously in terms of diverse experience, expertise, connections to the wider world, clout, and all of the other assets that board members bring to the boardroom. So bottom line, you're in a rapidly changing field. It's filled with what I call erroneous assumptions. You've got to be very careful. You think twice before you accept advice. And if you do, you'll probably succeed in building the kind of partnership that lasts. So let's take a moment here, look at a couple of other questions, and then we'll take a break for your questions. I'd like you to think, at least after this program today, how you can begin to develop your board savviness. And I mentioned earlier a few ways that have tended to work well. You can build a library. If you haven't already, I hope you have a good library of periodicals and books, because now the field is beginning to generate a literature the past 10 years or so. You can look for conferences, and there are some really good ones. Most state and national associations feature workshops on governance at their annual conference, annual meeting. I, for example, speak about 10 times a year at national conferences on the governance function. You can look for mentors, of course, and then always be on the lookout for those insidious foes. I've mentioned a few, but keep your eyes open for others. Don't accept what someone tells you is the sensible course of action before you give it second thoughts. Okay, let's take a break. It's early in our program. Let me know what questions you might have at this point, and I'll be happy to address them. Jason?
Thank you, Doug. I think we're off to a great start so far. We're going to now have our first live question and answer session. If you have a question for Doug, just use the raise hand button on the lower left, and we'll call on you. When we call your name, please press *7 on your phone to unmute your line, then ask your question. When we move to another question, press *6 to mute your line. Since this program is being recorded, the muting helps reduce any background noise or interference. Doug, it looks like we have a question from Leslie Lever. Leslie, if you could press *7 on your phone to ask your question, please.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
My question is, how are you this morning?
I'm well, thanks. And you?
Fantastic.
Good.
So my question, you talk about not falling into the trap of reducing the size of your board too much. Do you have an opinion as to what the most efficient size is for a particular board?
Well, I've learned to expect that question. It's obviously not a science, this area of question of board size, but here's what I've learned. At the very least, because diversity of the experience, expertise, connections to stakeholders, to funders, and so on is so important, I think of a board of minimum 15 members. Now, in terms of manageability, think of a range of 15 to 30 board members. And obviously, the larger the board gets, the more you have to pay attention to structure in terms of board engagement. You're going to have well-designed committees as a board gets larger, but you'll get a real payoff. Now, some of you are going to roll your eyes, but I have to tell you, some of the best boards I've ever worked with are even larger than 30. A premier board I work closely with, the International Economic Development Council, with some 55 members on its board, has been stunningly successful in growing internationally, developing new programs, increasing its membership, and the CEO spends a lot of time closely working with the board. I don't recommend a board that large, but I just want you to know that size does not, even of larger boards, does not decrease governing effectiveness. In fact, it tends to increase it because of diversity. So think in terms of ideally around 15, maybe up into about 30, and you can get larger, but you want to be really careful you don't get smaller because you lose too much.
Thank you so much for that perspective. That was very helpful.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Doug. At this point, it doesn't look like we have any other hands raised, so I think we'll move on for now.
Okay. So, my friends, let's go to the second specific topic. We've talked about having a board-savvy CEO in place, and I can't emphasize too strongly that if you're not a pretty board-savvy CEO, if you haven't mastered the governing game, if you don't pay a lot of attention to the relationship with the board, these other things I'll be talking about are highly unlikely alone to build that relationship. But they are important, and one of them is meticulous management. And there are three keys to this. As is so often the case, a standing committee is very helpful. And a committee that's becoming very common nationally in terms of relationship management between the board and the CEO is called governance or board operations. Many of my clients have a governance or board operations committee that specifically focuses on the relationship. It's a place for the CEO to come to sit down and talk with this committee and talk about issues in the relationship and so on. A committee guarantees attention. If you leave it open and you say, well, I'll deal with the whole board, it's very unlikely that it can be well handled. The second key is that you do have rules of the game for communication and interaction between the board and the CEO. They're formal. Many of my clients adopt them by resolution. They're updated regularly by the governance or board operations committee, and they keep us from stepping on each other's toes. And so it works very well. And third, you want to focus heavily on building a partnership with the chair of your board. And quite often, I know we get chairs we don't welcome, and we think, oh my God, how did this ever happen? But you've got to give it the old college try, because the chair of the board needs to be a close partner if you're going to succeed in building the relationship. So think about communication and interaction guidelines that you might adopt in your organization or have adopted that can help you keep the relationship healthy. Let me give you some real examples from my life as a speaker and consultant. Many CEOs do a weekly e-update for board members so that their board members never get caught off guard by things that happen. You don't have the case of a board member standing in a supermarket line and learning about something really critical because the CEO makes a point of keeping the board in the loop. Many CEOs are meeting one-on-one with board members. Now, that's difficult if you're a state or national association. If you're a local nonprofit, like a college or a hospital or a children's services agency, it's a lot easier, but you have to give it a try. It's very important to have one-on-one direct interaction, monthly if possible, but at least quarterly, and that's a common technique. You also, by the way, need to have guidelines for board member communication with your senior executives, with staff reporting to the CEO. Now, a very powerful trend, and I certainly subscribe to it myself, is that board members should be able to have contact with executives reporting to the CEO. That you would not want the CEO to become a bottleneck between the executive team and board members. But you got to have rules to govern that, obviously, or you're going to run into trouble. And one of the classic rules is that board members can call executive team members and ask for information, but they cannot ask for information that requires significant time to gather, and they definitely cannot give direction to staff. And those two rules, more than any other, probably help to keep the relationship healthy. But you do want communication, and you don't want the CEO to be the only person in regular contact with board members. Now, let's look at the board chair. How are you going to build a close working relationship with your chair? The first step, in my experience, is to sit down with your board chair as soon as she or he takes office and talk about how you're going to divide the leadership labor. And it's usually fairly simple, with one exception I'll share with you, but it's very, very important to have a sit down and talk, because you're both very prominent people. Your board chair is very likely to be very prominent in your community, whether it's geographical or whether it's professional, as with an association. And you're also going to want to think of ways to provide your board chair with what I call non-monetary compensation. Most board chairs are not paid. The great majority, probably 99% of board members, including board chairs, are not paid. Some school board members are in states like Florida, paid $30,000, $40,000 a year, but that's very rare. So you're going to have to focus on benefits, what I call non-monetary compensation, that you can provide your chairs so that they help cement the relationship. One is to make sure your chair succeeds in leading the board. Don't let that person fend for herself or himself, but you play a very strong role in helping your chair succeed, and also help your chair achieve professional objectives and to get some reasonable ego satisfaction from being your board chair. Now, in terms of the division of labor, as I said, that's not rocket science. Obviously, the board chair runs the board, and that means leading the board's deliberations. They're really going to need your help to do that, and you've got to make sure they succeed. But it's clearly their role, and the CEO doesn't ever claim that as a function. Of course, the board chair has no responsibility for internal operations. That's your job as CEO. Okay, we're fine then. We got a fairly clear division of labor, except when you come to the area of external stakeholder relations. And whether you're an association or whether you're a local nonprofit, as a matter of fact, this is a shared function, almost without exception. Board chairs expect to have an external role. They come to the job expecting they will. So you're going to have to sit down and talk about who does what when. Do you ever share the podium together? Do you go to the editorial board of the local newspaper together? I will say board-savvy CEOs know to get the board chair heavily engaged in external relations because it's ego-satisfying and it tends to cement the relationship, but you got to talk about it. And you've also got to talk about the fact that the board chair does not supervise the CEO, does not supervise you, has no authority to do that, cannot give you directions. And there are no exceptions to that. Or I should say there's only one exception, and that's if your board did explicitly delegate the board chair to direct you in one aspect or another of your job. That would be unfortunate if the board did it, but that would be the only exception. The board speaks as a whole to the CEO, never the board chair. So, as a board-savvy CEO, you really want to think about how you can get to know your board chair as thoroughly and as soon as possible. What's their style of communication? Do they like one-on-one meetings? The majority of board chairs I've worked with do like one-on-one meetings, and they expect to get personal attention from the CEO. Do they like written briefings? Some do, some don't. If they do, then you make an effort. But even more important than that, what do you know about their aspirations? What do they want to achieve from being board chair? And I have seen when the CEOs have really taken the trouble to dig this out, an amazing array of aspirations and objectives that chairs bring to their board. For example, I worked with a CEO and a board chair recently where the board chair really wanted to become a better speaker. Now, that doesn't sound very earth-shaking, but it was a sincere desire of the board chair to become more comfortable at the podium, partly because she wanted her she wanted this to contribute to her professional development beyond chairing the board. So this would be a great opportunity, but this couldn't happen unless the CEO was aware of it and could actually help her get speaking engagements, could help coach her on speaking, which the CEO, by the way, did, and it helped to build a very strong relationship. I worked recently with in fact, I've worked over a period of years with the chair of a very prominent transportation board in Albany, New York, and This board chair is now president of the American Public Transportation Association, the highest volunteer position, but that didn't happen automatically. The CEO had to support it and help the chair go through the volunteer ranks to reach the top spot at APTA, which has been an immensely satisfying experience, very ego-satisfying. And there are all kinds of other little things you can do to provide your board chair with what's called non-monetary compensation that will help cement your relationship with this person and guarantee that this person is in your corner as CEO when you launch initiatives. You get a phone call, for example, that there's a position open on the Economic Development Commission, the new Economic Development Commission in your community, and you're aware that your board chair is strongly interested in the area of economic development. And so that enables you to recommend that your board chair fill that position. If you don't think about it, if you're not aware of it, you might just accept that position yourself. But because you think about it, because you know your board chair, you're able to offer that non-monetary compensation to the chair. You get a call from the press that they want to do an article, let's say on a major initiative that you've launched in the community. Let's say it's a new residential center for children who are developmentally challenged. And this is the work you're involved in. You've got a really new, innovative center that you've launched. A reporter wants to talk about it. If you're not careful, you will forget your board chair. And you'll just go ahead and do it. I mean, it comes with the turf. You'll think, oh, that's the CEO's job. But a really board-savvy CEO will know to say to the reporter, I'd like to include my board chair in our meeting because the board chair is very central to this initiative and has a lot to offer. And believe me, it will not go unnoticed that you made this happen. I want to tell you a little real-life story that I experienced recently that's a real dramatic case in point. I arrived in the boardroom for a meeting of a large nonprofit in the Southeast a couple of years ago, and I had a meeting with the board chair and the CEO to talk about a governance improvement initiative we were involved in. And by the way, this nonprofit had recently accomplished a merger with another nonprofit, a very, very positive move in the community, a way of expanding services and consolidating budgets and so on. A very positive move, widely viewed as a very sensible move. So I walked into the boardroom, and the board chair sitting there. The CEO was on a phone call. And the board chair was seething, my friends. I do mean seething. And I said, oh, hey, what's going on? You look kind of upset. And he said, well, take a look at this. And he showed me a column in the local paper and featuring this merger and how it had taken place and so on, and what a benefit it was going to be for the community and also for the two organizations in terms of their services and financial stability. And so I quickly scanned the article, and who do you think was quoted repeatedly? only the CEO. Not a word about the board chair. And I happen to know this board chair, a prominent attorney, had donated hours, and at his billable rate, believe me, that was a substantial contribution to getting this merger accomplished. He donated significant time, very prominent attorney in the community, and so he gave generously, and yet the CEO didn't even think about the need to include him in the session with the reporter. And it was a huge faux pas. It almost ended the relationship, and probably should have. It was a terrible oversight. To me, inexcusable, actually. And it took a lot of effort to overcome the damage. But it's a classic case of a missed opportunity. Here's a reporter coming. Here's a tremendous initiative, getting a lot of community attention. Board chair generously donated time to making it happen, providing free legal advice. You would think it would be a no-brainer to involve the board chair in the meeting with the reporter, and also to make sure that the board chair was quoted prominently in the article. I couldn't believe it had happened, but it's certainly an instructive case. And then, even though it might sound a little pedestrian, keep in mind that board chairs don't automatically succeed in chairing the board. It kind of depends on experience they've had, but many board chairs, this is their first experience chairing that board. They're going to need a lot of very practical hands-on assistance in playing this role. And board-savvy CEOs know this, and they make sure it happens. And so before every board meeting, many CEOs I work with have a one-on-one meeting, I'm sure many of you do, with the board chair, go over the agenda in detail, talk about issues coming up, make sure the board chair is very knowledgeable about all of the major issues that are going to be discussed at the board meeting. And then you've got finer touches. One I've seen more recently than I used to see is CEOs drafting a board chair report for the board meeting. Now, CEOs almost always deliver the CEO report at the board meeting. Why wouldn't the board chair have a report? Well, probably because a CEO who's not very board savvy never thought of it. And if you think for a minute how easy that would be to do, the CEO makes sure that a brief report is drafted. It showcases the board chair, especially if you have much attendance at board meetings, or if board meetings are televised, it can be immensely ego-satisfying. That, my friends, is what you call non-monetary compensation. And when you take the time, and normally it doesn't take a lot to think of it and do it, it can pay off handsomely. So, before we get into our third topic, let's take our customary break here. And any questions you have, any observations you'd like to share, now's another opportunity to do that. Jason?
Thank you, Doug. If you have any questions, please press the raise hand button in the lower left of your screen. It looks like we do have a question from Bruce. Bruce, if you could unmute your line and ask your question, please.
Are you there, Bruce?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Lots of excellent advice and wisdom. Your years of experience show in this. It really speaks a lot to me.
Thank you.
I have a situation, let's say, where we have a very experienced board chair and really knows the governance well. but it's challenging because sometimes he knows the business of this nonprofit also so well that it's hard to make him like a partner in this and welcome him into the work I do. So I'm just wondering if you can speak about that a little bit, and just how to kind of not necessarily creating like a hard firewall. I mean, it's kind of like trying to prevent the board from or the executive committee, let's say, all the executive officers from micromanaging, which they don't, but when they talk to me, it almost feels that way.
Well, that's an excellent question. I appreciate your asking that, and I wish there were simple, easy answers to questions like this, but they are complex. Number one, this is where structure comes into play, and we're going to be talking a fair amount about structure in a few minutes. Doing it one-on-one with your board chair is, let's say, if your board chair has a tendency to want to share your function, and that's not what I'm talking about as a partnership. When we talk about collaboration and partnership, we're not talking about the board chair sharing your CEO role. We're talking about the fact that there are some shared roles where you as the CEO and the board chair can work together. But we are not talking about the chair poaching on your turf. That should not be allowed. However, as CEO, you can't really easily discipline your board chair. So you have to work a little bit sideways, as is so often the case with CEOship, kind of you're leading from behind. One way you can lead from behind that we'll be talking about is making sure that there is a well-defined governance or board operations committee that the board chair heads. And the benefit for you is that you have other board members engaged in the room. It's not you and the board chair alone. It's the board chair and those board members, and that you have one of the products of that committee and its deliberations could very well be a job description for the board chair. And of course, as CEO, you would want to to be the person who did the draft for discussion with the committee. That's non-threatening. It makes good sense because your board chair probably turns over every year or two. There are seldom board chairs for life, not in democratic countries, but it occasionally happens. But most of the board chairs change every year or two. So you can make a strong case that, gee, it would be helpful to have a good, solid description of the board chair's role. Well, the minute you get that developed, and by the way, I mentioned the blogs that my company manages in cooperation with national associations. There's tons of free content about the board chair's role that you can find there. So it's not like you have to invent this. It would not be hard to come up with a one-page description. Once you do something like that, you begin to corral the board chair. You get it adopted by the governance committee, and so it creates guidelines. You can also develop guidelines like interaction guidelines that limit the board chair's authority without you having to be the one that directly challenges the board chair, because you won't win if you challenge the board chair or any other board member. You'll lose credit and you'll endanger your job, obviously. Board members typically don't attack a board chair. So you have to figure out a way of using structure to limit the board chair. Does that make sense? Bruce?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I hear you on that. I guess the fine line is when I'm trying to kind of protect my, area of operation and have this kind of firewall there. But at the same time, I don't want to necessarily alienate the board chair from the board, as you say. But at the same time, the board chair frequently is the president of the organization, and you have a treasurer and secretary, sometimes a vice president, and their roles are pretty specific as to their legal responsibilities, on oversight, signature authority. There's lots of areas like that. And so, how do I, sometimes those areas, they get blurred because they have, a certain amount of legal authority that I need from them and need to work with them, but at the same time, trying not to lose my responsibilities. I mean, I could always refer back to the job description. This is what you hired me for. Let me do my job, kind of thing. But how do you deal with those kind of challenges?
Or you've got to accept the role of being the one that facilitates some of this or gets it facilitated. For example, but it never can be you against the board chair because that's a non-starter. That'll get you in trouble. So you're always facilitating some kind of process leading from behind. For example, you could have your governance or board operations committee come up with a description of how the board chair and CEO should be working together. That doesn't sound threatening or dire. It sounds very sensible. It guarantees that we collaborate. And so by doing that, you lay out boundaries without ever using the term boundary. That's what you got to try to do. Most board members I've worked with over 25 some years are very open to that kind of thing. If it doesn't sound like you're trying to control them or limit them, that's when you run into trouble. So, number one, though, a great place to start is making sure you have a governance committee or a board operations committee. I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. This is one of the huge steps forward in the area of nonprofit governance the last few years. So you definitely want to make sure that happens.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank
Any
you,
others?
Doug. I don't see any others, so I think we can continue on here.
Okay, that was a great question, and we have more time at the end to have some questions. So let's turn to the final area and that we'll be talking about today. It's obviously not the final area in this very complex field of nonprofit governance, but it's a very important area. We've talked about the importance of being board savvy as a CEO, being very knowledgeable, being very positive, making governance a top priority function, and I really mean top priority function. We've talked about the fact that you've got to manage relationships and creatively use things like communication and interaction guidelines, and also use what I call non-monetary compensation to build the relationship with your board chair. Now let's talk about structure and process, and this is the piece you've got to build into this. And fortunately, there has been a lot of work about how, in recent years, how we can use structure and process to turn board members into what I call owners of their governing work, who feel committed and who are hence better partners for you. So let's jump into this. And a good place to begin is for you to keep in mind, excuse me, that ownership is a powerful force for good when you're building your relationship with the board. Board members who feel like owners of their governing work tend to be more committed to it and more reliable partners for you. They take it more seriously. But the only way they're going to acquire this feeling of ownership is through engagement. If they end up getting just thumbing through finished documents, you know, the classic case, okay, here's the budget. The CEO recommends the budget to the board. Here's your budget. Let's review it. And they're thumbing through that budget. They will feel zero ownership of that budget. They will feel more like an external critic, and they'll tend to pot shoot and nitpick and whatnot. Ownership comes through creative engagement that's meaningful. And I'm going to show you what I mean in a couple of minutes, but you've got to place a priority on that. And the only way you're going to get meaningful board member engagement is through well-defined process. So you're going to look at the processes where there's an opportunity for creative board member engagement and use those processes as ways of turning your board members into owners. Now, that might sound a little abstract, but as we go along, I think you're going to see what I mean. Now, there are basically three keys to turning your board members into governors who feel like they own their work, who feel like it's theirs, who get a lot of satisfaction in doing it. One is to make sure that all of your board members really do understand what governing is. Do not leave it vague. There's a term I detest. I hear it all the time. It has very little meaning, and that's to call the board a policy-making body. It's strictly correct. It just doesn't even begin to describe the work of governing. Policies are rules. You need a few. You got them. Update them every so often. End of story. It's maybe 8% or 5% of what a board does is update policies or the rules for your organization. So make sure they understand in detail what governing is. We're going to talk about that. Number two, help them become accountable for their governing work. And there are very practical ways of doing that using your governance or board operations committee. When board members feel they have some accountability for what they're doing formally, they'll tend to feel like owners. And then, of course, above everything else, make sure you've got structure and processes in place to engage board members. So let's look at each of these, and let's start with governing work. Now, this is kind of fascinating. When I was moving from Dallas, Texas, where I did a stint, to Tampa Bay, I went from Cleveland, where I spent 20-some years, to Dallas and then to Tampa Bay. I had signed a contract to do a book called Extraordinary Board Leadership for Aspen. And I had a research assistant at the University of Oregon, Matilda Dees, because I didn't have a lot of time to do formal research. I was mainly drawing on my hands-on experience. But I wanted her to take a look at the literature and what people were saying about the work of governing. She called me, Matilda did, about a month into the process, and she said, "Doug, you won't believe this. I'm not finding any definition of what it means to govern in a specific nuts and bolts sense." She said, "All I see is sort of pablum, is sort of squishy stuff like, oh, boards are policy-making bodies." And she said, it doesn't mean anything. And so that got me really to thinking, and I want to share with you the product of that thinking that I actually, for the first time in this book, really used in a systematic way. The book's called Extraordinary Board Leadership. It's now published by Jones and Bartlett. They acquired Aspen, so it's now their imprint. And the first thing that really struck me thinking about governing work is what boards do is answer questions at the highest possible level. They're a really high-powered question-answering machine. Now, you as CEO answer the great majority of operational questions with your team, but there are some we really depend on the board to get engaged in. And one question, you might call it the strategic question, is where should we take our nonprofit, our organization, in terms of its programming and services and revenue mix and performance targets? What do we want this to become? How big? What range of services? And we typically answer that question by updating a vision statement periodically and particularly some sort of strategic planning. Now, I'm not talking about a god-awful 5-year monster, Soviet-type plan weighing 10 pounds. Those things are useless, dead as a doornail now. But I am talking about a set of growth targets and initiatives to develop your organization that answer the question, where are we headed? What do we want to be? The second key question your board has to be involved in is to define at any given time who we are and how we're different from other nonprofits and other public organizations in our community. Now, this is a different question. This doesn't have anything to do with vision. It has a lot to do with mission. What's our mission? And mission, is a fancy way to say what services do we deliver to what clients or what customers, and how do we do it? And then we kind of summarize that in a mission, but that's what a mission really is. It's not a vision of what we want to be. It's who we are. And most of all, it's the budget. So when the board adopts a budget, it adopts a concrete definition of who we are, because if we're not spending money on it, we aren't doing it. So the budget has no peer in describing who we are. And the third question is particularly interesting to the wider community and funders like foundations and state departments and anyone who pays. If you've got any tax dollars, believe me, the people who pay taxes care. And that's how well are we doing? How well are we performing in terms of achieving programmatic goals and serving our clients and customers? How well are we performing in terms of generating revenues and managing financial resources and human resources? And so those are three preeminent questions. But they sound sort of abstract, but they are what governing's all about. So let's drill down now a little bit. Let's get to a more nuts and bolts level. What I realized, especially writing this book now almost 20 years ago, what I realized is that, forget about vague terms like policymaking, boards are organizations that make decisions and make judgments. That's the work of governing. Governing is decision-making, and it's making judgments about very concrete things. There's nothing abstract about it at all. I call them governing products. And that may sound strange to you, but I'll explain what I mean. And so boards make decisions about very concrete governing products that are worth the board's attention, and they make judgments based on concrete documentation. And those decisions and judgments tend to flow along the lines you see here. Planning, the big kahuna. It has no equal in terms of governance as a stream. Planning is the whole future. What are we putting in place next year and beyond? It's the Columbia, the Mississippi, the Potomac, the Colorado of governing streams. It's so powerful. And we make a number of decisions in the area, like updating values and vision, developing the annual budget, developing strategic targets, and so on, the whole future. And so the board is an organization explicitly charged to make critical big decisions in the planning area. It's also charged to monitor our organizational performance, so it makes judgments based on financial and non-financial operating performance reports. The monthly or quarterly financial report, the quarterly performance, operating performance report, and so on. And in the area of external stakeholder relations, a number of decisions about such things as what messages should we be sending to our community? What kind of image are we trying to build? And who are the critical stakeholders? And what are our strategies for maintaining those relationships? So governing is a very, very concrete process. It's nothing mystical about it. And how well you do, how well your board does, depends on your helping that board to get engaged in processes that will get those decisions made, and how to engage them in a way that makes them feel like they really own what they're doing. Now, I want to give you a little bit of warning here, and this is one of the areas that gets a lot of discussion, and it's a kind of dangerous area for CEOs. What you need to keep in mind is that boards are primarily governing bodies. And that's not going to surprise you. But remember, they are often asked to do non-governing work. And if you let, and there's nothing wrong with that, but if you let the two get mixed up, then you're going to be in serious trouble, especially if you let non-governing work consume governing work. So just keep in mind that we've over the years, we've tended to look to board members to do more than just govern. For example, in the area of executive management, it's common, and I love it. I think it's a great idea to book board members to speak in your community. They tend to have a very, very positive and powerful impact on your image if you support them in speaking, whether it's a chamber luncheon, League of Women's Voters meeting, whatever it is, whether it's you might get them to testify. If you're a national association on the Hill in Washington, as they say, or in your state capital, you bring them with you and they speak. As you well know, we often want to engage boards in fundraising. I will say that's one of the least effective areas I've ever seen. It tends to be most effective with very affluent board members who are willing to write large checks. Unfortunately, most of us aren't blessed with those board members. But if you're the Cleveland Museum of Art, one of the largest, best endowed museums in the world, then obviously you'll have a number of board members in Cleveland who can write $1 million checks. But still, there are ways of engaging board members in making phone calls to raise money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there are also areas where you might draw on board members. You've got to be careful for technical advice, whether it's legal, financial. Just remember, though, that's not governing. And that's doing work. That's getting free work from a group of volunteers who are experts or who have contacts in the community. So your challenge as CEO, and this is where you'll have to have a governance or board operations committee to protect you. Your challenge is to make sure the board doesn't skew over into non-governing work, because if it does, you won't get key governing decisions made, and you'll have a board that's very dissatisfied because it's not doing a good job of governing. And dissatisfied board members are very dangerous for you. For the obvious reason, they tend not to blame themselves for their dissatisfaction. They blame the CEO. Now, let's talk then about board self-management. We talked a little bit about governing. How can you get your board to be more accountable? Well, there are two aspects to this where you can engage your board. One is developing the people, your board's composition, and the other is managing the board's actual performance. Now, obviously, you as a CEO can't do this yourself, but you can support it and you can make sure it gets done. And the idea of strengthening the people is first to, by hook or by crook, strengthening the composition of your board, and then once you've got the people, the bodies on the board, then develop their governing skills and their governing knowledge. And it's really, really helpful, as I say in point one, to have a committee of the board responsible for this. I've probably mentioned 5 or 6 or 7 times a committee called Governance and Board Operations. I'll show you that committee in a minute, but this is really very critical because now you've got a group you can work with. Usually it's the board chair plus committee, your committee chairs making up the committee, but you've got a group to work with on developing your composition. Now, the best way of doing that is to work with your governance committee to develop a profile of desirable attributes and qualifications. And it helps also to have a job description for the board so people understand what they're getting into when you try to recruit them for the board. And you develop a profile of attributes and qualifications you use to look for board members if you're self-appointing. Now, the great majority of nonprofit boards, fortunately for you all who are nonprofits, are self-appointing boards. However, there's a large sector of boards that are elected and boards that are appointed by third parties. Almost every school board, and almost everyone, not all, but about 90, I would say 5% or more of the school boards in the United States are elected. So it's very difficult to shape the composition of an elected board. Virtually 100% of the transportation boards in the country are appointed by local elected officials or by the governor. A few are elected, but only a handful. So if you're self-appointing, obviously you can use this profile to fill board vacancies. If you're not, you use your profile by sharing it with appointing authorities or sharing it with electors who are electing your board, speaking about it publicly and whatnot so people understand what your board does and the kind of people who are good on the board. Once you get the people, of course, then you've got the challenge of developing their skills and talent. So a couple of questions I want you to think about after today's program. One, what are some attributes and qualifications you would want in your profile when you're recruiting new board members? And over the years, I've worked with some really, really well-crafted profiles and not everything on the profile is obvious. For example, I'm working with a board now that has on its profile, we want board members who have already served successfully on other boards. Whoa, that's not an ordinary provision. Very powerful. It's a way of elevating your board's performance from the get-go is by looking for people who have a lot of experience in governing. You also might have on your profile such characteristics as team player, passion for the mission of our organization, time available, because if they can't devote the time, then they aren't going to be effective board members, and so on. And once you got them, of course, the best way of developing knowledge and skills is a good orientation for new board members. But I want to caution you. Too often, orientation is delivered by staff and focuses on programs, administrative structure, financing, with very little information on the one job the board's supposed to do it, that's govern. Orientation, many orientations actually appear to be designed to prepare people to micromanage, to focus on how we manage the organization and what our program goals are and so on. Well, some of that's good, but remember, the reason they're on the board is not to manage, it's to govern. So you want to focus on the board's role, the board structure, and whatnot. Now, performance, so getting the people, and then you can do other things like send them to conferences, make sure, or maybe you have training sessions on governance periodically and whatnot. Now, when you turn to performance, this isn't really rocket science. A little bit goes a long way, and it can improve board performance and the relationship. It's good to have your governance or board operations committee develop performance targets and standards and then really adopt them and then play a role in sort of monitoring how well the board's doing. And the CEO obviously can't do this. And doing a little bit of it will tend to build a lot of board accountability. I know some of you might be rolling your eyes. I will tell you, though, a great majority of the board members I've worked with over my quarter century in this business have wanted performance standards and respond very positively to having them, because it rewards those who really do want to work hard, and they do want to be evaluated. That's how they got to the board in the first place. And so you want things like attend meetings, attend board meetings, attend committee meetings, come prepared. You might have some non-governing responsibilities that you want to add. Just be careful with that. But you are expected to attend this conference every other year or something like that. And just make sure, though, that you've got a formal set of performance targets, and you can include standards for how we treat each other respectfully, or you could say, if we make a decision as a board, you won't cut us down publicly. You can enforce these things typically legally, but they do tend to build feelings of accountability among board members. Now I'm going to deal with one final thing, and then we'll take our last break for questions, and that is structure and the tie of structure to process. I've become a very strong committee advocate in the past few years. I didn't start there. After all, it's not exactly an exciting subject. But at this point, professionally, based on my experience, I consider committees indispensable if they're well designed to strong governing and to the board CEO partnership. And they're just workhorses of governing. They ensure that board meetings are well prepared for, and hence they become more productive. They promote interaction. You can't get much interaction at a full board meeting, but a committee meeting definitely, even if it's publicly posted. All of my public clients post committee meetings, never causes a problem. But less obvious are a couple roles they play. They're a great place to flesh out process for engaging board members. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm not saying they take the lead. The CEO is the one that does thinking before the committee meeting about how to engage board members. But it's a great place to reach agreement on how we're going to be engaged in key areas. And also, it serves a hugely important purpose for the CEO. Every client I have, and have had in 25 years, all reports at board meetings, all recommendations are made by committee chairs or committee members. So the CEO never uses her or his precious line of credit trying to get the board to act. The CEO interacts intensively with the responsible committees. They take recommendations to the board. They play what I call the spear carrier role. So what is a well-designed committee? Well, basically, you remember those streams of functions we had? Planning, performance monitoring, external relations. Well, you want your committees to correspond to your key areas of board decision-making and judgment-making. If they don't, then what you're going to end up with, if you're not careful, is a series of silos that invite micromanagement. If you have a siloed board, the story's over in terms of high-impact governing. It's not possible. Silos are narrow administrative areas like personnel, finance, or they're specific programmatic areas like residential services, bus operations, whatever. None of those things have anything to do with governing. Counseling as a function. So if you have a board that's siloed into administrative or programmatic areas, you can really give up in terms of high-impact governing and much strong board ownership. So what we're really looking for is something like this, where the board's at the top, cutting across everything. Planning's planning for everything. Monitoring's monitoring everything. External relations are all external relations, so that the board cuts across the silos. We pay CEOs to integrate silos. You have to have silos to run an organization. You can't have them to govern it. They're totally different functions, and silos invite micromanagement. They're extremely dangerous. So here's a model committee structure, excuse me, that I'm sorry, I was on airplanes for some humongously long trips recently and got kind of congested, so forgive me. But here you see this picture. You've got the governance committee here, and then you've got your broad-based committees below the line. Every one of those committees obviously cuts across everything. They're not siloed. And this guarantees high-impact governing decisions, also guarantees they stay out of micromanagement because they are too broadly charged. Governance, I've talked a lot about, is just a committee on board operations. And you want the CEO to sit with this committee. Usually it's headed by the board chair, and usually it includes the committee chair, sometimes one or two officers in addition to the board chair, but it's your committee on board operations. Also a good place to manage the relationship with the CEO. And as I've said, this structure can be effective if you make sure that you build certain characteristics in. For example, that reports at board meetings and recommendations come from committee chairs and members. And it works, my friends. It works. I've never seen a case where you couldn't run a board meeting this way. It takes a lot of preparation and help for the people making the reports, but it builds tremendous satisfaction, including ego satisfaction. You want to make sure that you only assign a person to one committee because then they get involved in depth. You want to make sure you're rotating committee chairs and members, maybe annual, maybe biennial, whatever. And by doing these kinds of things, your structure can function at peak performance. Now, what does all this have to do with designing process? Well, as a matter of fact, once you've got a good committee structure, you've got a place for the CEO to sit down and talk about how to engage board members. And so committees not only prepare for board meetings, that's a given, but they also become a vehicle for sitting down with the CEO taking the lead in the discussion I'm not talking a wimpo CEO. I'm talking about a very strong CEO. Has a lot of ideas about how to engage board members, but here's a place to discuss that. And when you do talk about process for engaging board members, you want to keep in mind you have two concerns. One is, if it's a budget process, we do need a well-crafted budget to come out of it. So technically it has to be sound, but also the participation of board members needs to be the kind that will reinforce their sense of ownership, so they don't just get a finished document. They have a chance to shape the governing decisions they're making, the governing products they're making decisions about. For example, in my experience, a great time to update processes toward the end of the fiscal year. I've sat in any number of these meetings where the CEO comes into the planning committee. It's toward the end of the fiscal year, and we're saying, are we going to update our values and vision statements? When's the last time we did that? If we're going to do it, how do we do it? Should we put a task force together? Should we use a retreat? How are we going to identify the big strategic issues we're facing? When does that take place? When we're producing the annual budget, what work sessions are we going to have? What's going to happen at the work sessions? When are they going to take place? And so on and so forth. In other words, to think, where do we engage board members in this process so they don't just get a finished budget? Same thing with performance monitoring. At the end of the year, your performance monitoring committee sits back with the CEO, with the CFO, and you talk about how you can improve performance reporting to the board. Should we use better graphics in our reports? Should they be PowerPoint reports as opposed to god-awful pages of numbers and rows and columns of numbers and you need a calculator to understand? And then once we get the reports, what are guidelines for reviewing them? And we've got, this is where updating policy tends to come. About 5% of what the board does is the CEO every so often will say we need to update our contracting policy, our human resource manual, and this is a good committee to run that through. And that's the extent of policy making and governing. External relations, once again, it's a case of thinking what's the image we want to convey, get the board and members on that committee involved in thinking about what messages we need to send out. And this is where you review strategies for image building and for working with your key stakeholders in the community. And if you want to book board members to speak, this is a great committee for involving board members. But sort of to conclude this, you can see committees are very, very productive vehicles, potentially, for the CEO to sit with the committee at least once a year and update how we're engaging board members at the right point in things like strategic planning and budgeting and monitoring performance so that we don't just hit them with finished documents. Just never forget, forcing a board to thumb through finished documents is insulting and dispiriting, and it builds zero ownership. It's guaranteed to turn board members into critics rather than partners. Don't do it. Always figure out the right place to engage board members, and a good way to figure it out is to work with the responsible committee. And here are a couple of questions you can think about after our program today as you go over the slides. I think the slides are available to you. You can also call me. Do you see my contact information? anyone has any other questions we couldn't cover, I'm always happy to answer questions. Email me or give me a call, whatever. And Jason, do we have time for a couple more questions? I know we're pretty much to the end here.
Sure, Doug.
I'm happy to stick around a couple more minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Can you hear me, Doug?
Pardon?
I said, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think you provided some extremely useful and interesting information and anecdotes for our attendees here. I see we do have a question from Ed. Ed, if you could press *7 to unmute your line, please.
Hi, Ed.
Hi, Doug. I just want to let you know I appreciate your expertise in this area of governance, and I think we're only scratching the surface with where you're going with this to produce better boards. And I guess my question is, how would you encourage your CEO to pursue a board savvy management style when they've been used to a very top-down style of management for many years, short of firing them?
Short of
firing them.
Okay, well, firing is the dramatic and all too common approach. But I want to make sure I understand your question. We've got a CEO whose style has been a top-down sort of authoritarian style.
Yes.
And what can we do about that?
How can you encourage them to go to the newer, more progressive, I'd say, proactive message that you're bringing?
Well, there are a number of ways. I spend a lot of time in CEO coaching, so obviously that's one way. Not all CEOs are obviously interested in that, but that is a way, because then you're impressing on them. Even if it doesn't come naturally, it will help you professionally. Short of that, I think there are books that, like the Board Savvy CEO that the Society sells, that make the point very dramatically and strongly that a collaborative style works very well in dealing with the board, in developing a partnership. So another way is to, hand them a book or encourage them to attend a session on governance at a conference, because commonly in these sessions there is discussion of the need for a particular style. And board members themselves can be very effective coaches if they are willing to play that role. So a CEO could sit down. Over the years, I've sometimes thought it would almost take a brain transplant at the Mayo Clinic to change style for some really old line executives. But generally, I find people are receptive to test, even if it doesn't come naturally, to test out new approaches. So there are different ways. If you're a friend of a CEO, I think recommending the right book or the right educational program, or just sitting down with the CEO and talking. Now, you can be a fairly authoritarian personality and still discipline yourself to sit down with the planning committee and brainstorm more creative involvement in the budget process. No matter what your instincts are, discipline's a powerful tool, if only to make sure you don't get fired by the board. So I can sit down and I can come to the planning committee and say, I think it would be useful to have a workshop early in the planning process of all board members to look at major operational issues before we begin to develop the budget. And by the way, I've worked with a lot of boards that hold what are called pre-budget operational issue sessions, where we want to lift up certain operational issues we want to get attention in the budget, whatever they are. And they could be relate to quality service, they could relate to safety. They could relate to some aspect of performance. But it's not difficult to discipline yourself, even if it's not instinctive. So those are my sort of off-the-cuff thoughts about that.
Well, thank you, Doug. I appreciate your comments, and keep up the good work in the governance area.
Any other?
I don't see any other questions at this point, Doug, so I think we can wrap up here. Thank you for sharing your experience with us today. We appreciate the insights and strategies you provided and know that they'll be put to good use within our organization. For those of you who are interested in purchasing any of Doug's books, please note that the members only section of the Society has his books available for a 20% discount. You can find the discount code in our members only section. I want to thank all of you for your wonderful questions and comments and for attending today's program. When you click on Exit the Conference in the upper right, you'll see an evaluation form. Please stop and take a moment to complete it. Your feedback is very important to us. We also want to again thank ReadyTalk for sponsoring this webinar. This concludes the program. You may now hang up your phone and exit the ReadyTalk platform. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for sitting in.
Bye-bye.
This conference is no longer being recorded.